So welcome. It's really hard to believe, but we have finally made it to the end. We are going to be looking at our very last group of animals. And the chapter in the book that you need to pay attention to is going to be chapter 28. And this last group is going to involve the mammals. Now, one thing that I think is really important is that everything that you've learned with amphibians, with reptiles, and with birds, I want you to make sure that you'll be able to make some comparisons between the group of mammals and the characteristics that we have seen in those previous groups. So of course, what we want to do first is we want to make sure that we look at some features, some characteristics that would make this particular group rather unique. And one of the first characteristics that definitely sticks out when you look at a mammal is that this group is the only group that actually has hair. Now, this hair can be used for lots of different things. It could be used for protection, it could be used for concealment, it could be used for waterproofing, depending on the type of mammal, buoyancy possibly if you have an aquatic type of mammal. Definitely some forms of communication, such as signaling, some sensory functions, in other words, pick up information from their environment. And then, of course, if we have hair, we cannot forget the idea that they can provide some sort of insulation for the animal as well. Now, most of the mammals are considered placental. There are a few unique groups that kind of are contradictory to this particular characteristic, but we'll talk about those more towards the end of the chapter. Now, they do have specialized teeth and jaws for processing diverse foods in most cases, and so we have a lot of different groups that fall into this major group, and a lot of them have varying diets, and so of course the teeth and the jaws might vary because of that reason. The nervous system is definitely more advanced than you would see in other animal groups, and well, when you think about mammals, you have to think about mammary glands, and mammary glands are basically a structure on this animal that's going to be used to produce milk and of course to nourish the newborn mammal. And as we had said, the very first thing that typically comes to mind when you mention the word mammal is the idea that these animals do have hair. Now, of course, if they have hair, then they have a rather unique integument. And an integument is basically an outer covering for an animal. So what we're really talking about here is we're talking about the mammal skin. Now, mammal skin is generally a bit thicker than most other vertebrates. It's composed of two areas. It's composed of an epidermis and it's composed of a dermis. And so down here in the diagram, you can see the epidermis is this very thin layer right through here. And the dermis is right here. And so these are the two primary layers for the integument or the skin. Now the dermis is definitely going to be thicker than the epidermis, as you can see down here. And in regions that are subject to abrasion, and an abrasion is simply thinking about maybe a scratch or an injury of some sort, the outer layers of the epidermis become a little bit thicker in some species with the addition of keratin. Now, because the hair is such a unique characteristic when comparing this group with other groups of animals, it's really important that we look at sort of the structure of this particular characteristic. Now, the hair itself is going to be rather reduced on humans, and it's going to exist as a few bristles on whales. And so what this is going to indicate to you is that there's a wide range of variety when it comes down to the amount of hair that you would find on the animal. Now, the hair follicle itself is an epidermal structure, which means it's going to fall right in this very thin layer towards the top, but it is going to lie somewhat in the dermis of the skin because if you notice, the root of the hair follicle is going to be embedded right down here. So a hair is going to grow continuously by a rapid proliferation of cells in the follicle. Now, proliferation basically means the addition of more cells. Now, the cells in the hair shaft are going to be shifted upwards, away from their source of nourishment, accumulate that keratin that we had talked about previously, then eventually die. And so a lot of the hair follicle that you would see right through here is going to be living tissue. And this is where those cells are going to proliferate or grow, and it's going to push that hair upwards. But once you get right outside of the epidermis, this is where the hair itself is going to die. The cells are going to die. And so this part of the hair would be considered non-living. Now, as we had said, keratin is going to be the same protein that we had talked about in previous groups, where we had talked about this keratin being involved in the formation of, for example, the nails, the claws, the hooves, and definitely the feathers that we had looked at in the birds. Now, when you look at mammals, you're going to notice that there are several different varieties of hair, and we're only going to mention a couple here. Most mammals will have somewhat of a dense and soft underhair, and this underhair is going to serve as insulation for most of these animals, and it's going to do this by trapping a layer of air. Now, they're also going to possibly have a coarse and a longer guard hair, and these guard hairs are going to be used to protect against wear and possibly provide coloration for the animal. Now, when you talk about the structure of a hair follicle, that hair follicle is going to be made up of 3 layers. And over here you can see the cuticle as being the most outside layer of that follicle. The cortex is going to be next, and that's going to be this rather brown area that you see right here. And the medulla is going to be in the very center of that follicle. So the medulla is the center, the cortex is going to be the pigmented granules that lie right outside of that medulla, and as we had said, the cuticle is the outermost layer, and it's composed mostly of scales, and you can see these scales right up here towards the top of this diagram. Now, in most cases, the hair will stop growing at a certain length. It's going to remain in the follicle until new growth eventually will push it out and then, of course, replace it by a new hair follicle. In most mammals, there are periodic molts of the entire coat. Most mammals will molt twice, and typically it's going to be seasonal, so there would be one molt in the spring and then probably one molt in the fall, with the winter coat usually being much heavier. And oftentimes you're going to notice there's going to be a difference in color depending on the season of the year. Some will have a rather white or lighter coat in the wintertime, and they usually use this for camouflage, and the same is going to go for a sort of a spring or a summer coat, which it typically tends to be a bit more brown. Now, there are some misconceptions when it comes down to some Arctic mammals. Some people actually believe, like you see over here on the right, that any animal that you would find in the Arctic, just because it's white, some people think it would be considered genetically an albino. But one thing that's important to understand is that if you are genetically albino, you're going to have pigment that's going to be completely absent everywhere within the body, and that includes the eyes as well as the skin. Now, besides being used maybe for insulation or maybe some adaptive coloration, there are some specialized hairs out there, such as the vibrissae or the whiskers of some animals, that are being used in a sensory type of function. And typically, these sensory hairs have sort of a tactile type of sense, and tactile means to touch. And oftentimes, they're being used by nocturnal mammals. And these are animals that are primarily active at night. Now, another good example of a modified type of hair is something that you might see in a porcupine, a hedgehog, and an echidna. And these are the quills, these very stiff hairs that are being used most likely as some sort of defense. Oftentimes, these hairs are barbed and they can break off very easily from the animal. Now, another way that you might find some of these keratinized structures would be in the form of horns or in antlers. And a lot of times these horns and antlers are going to be found in animals such as ruminants. And a ruminant would be something like a cow or a sheep. Deer are also considered ruminants. Now, the primary difference between a horn and an antler would be that a horn is actually a hollow sheath of keratinized epidermis. It's going to have a surrounding core of bone that's going to be rising from the skull. It's not normally shed by the animal, and it's usually not branched. And these horns actually do grow continuously, and they will occur in both sexes. Now, if you're looking at an antler, a lot of times antlers are going to be found in deer and in elk. And they're going to be composed of solid bone when they mature, and they tend to form beneath an annual spring covering of highly vascular velvet. Now, when we use the word vascular, we're referring to something that is definitely alive, and vascular would often refer to the veins that you would find that are being used to nourish and keep this particular covering alive. Now, except for caribou, only the males typically produce antlers. When growth is complete, the velvet is going to be removed, and usually they do this by rubbing the antlers against trees, and oftentimes this will happen just before the breeding season, because these antlers are often used to display and occasionally in confrontations between rival males when it comes down to fighting for territory or possibly a mate. Now, when you talk about mammals, of course, you're also talking about an animal that, in addition to hair, probably has quite a number of different types of glands. Mammals have the greatest variety of integumentary glands, and this would be glands that you would find in the skin. Now, there can be a couple of different types of sweat glands. One of them is considered an eccrine sweat gland, and these are found in the hairless regions of the animal. They tend to secrete a watery fluid that tends to draw heat away from the skin surface. Now, you also have an apocrine sweat gland, which are going to be open into the hair follicles themselves. They do not tend to function in temperature regulation and are typically correlated with reproductive function. So a lot of times when you think about things such as pheromones, oftentimes these types of sweat glands would be involved in producing this type of material to be picked up by a possible mate. Now, in addition to these two sweat glands, you need to also consider scent glands. And these are basically being used to allow communication between members of the same species. and they're typically being used to mark territory, possibly as a warning, and then of course as a defense signal against a rival animal. Now there's another type of gland called a sebaceous gland, and these sebaceous glands are most likely associated in particular with the hair follicles themselves, and they tend to lubricate the skin and keep the hair rather moist. Now there are also mammary glands, which are simply modified apocrine glands, and those are going to be rudimentary in males. In other words, they're not going to be fully developed, and they tend to occur only in females. Now typically mammals will have swollen mammae or mammary glands periodically when they are pregnant or nursing. And they're going to be swollen, of course, because this is where the milk is going to be produced and eventually secreted via nipples or the teats of the animal. Now, the exception to this is going to be the group called the monotremes. Now, monotremes do not have nipples or teats. They simply secrete their milk into a rather shallow depression on the mother's belly, and this is where it's simply going to be lapped up by the young monotreme. So that's going to finish up our very first screencast for Chapter 28. As always, please make sure that you have completed your screencast study guide before you come to class.